The Radical Secular Podcast, a demand for justice, equality, and rational public policy. Subscribe at YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and all the major podcast channels. Visit our website at theradicalsecular.com for articles, insights, and our complete library of episodes. Support us on Patreon and follow us on social media.
Hello and welcome back to the Radical Secular Podcast. I'm Christophe Defoe.
And I'm Joe Kipinti.
We were off last week for Thanksgiving, and this is our first show back. It's also the first show of the holiday season, and appropriately, Joe and I will be talking about navigating the relationship dynamics that folks encounter when they, quote, return home for the holidays. Before that, Joe and I, and by that I really mean Joe, will talk to you about the newly emerged Omicron variant. Should we all lock ourselves back in our homes? Let's find out. But first, I want to remind you that if you like our show, to make sure to subscribe, leave a review, check out our Patreon, and tell your friends to listen. New episodes post Mondays at noon Eastern on YouTube and all the major podcast channels. We also post new articles regularly in our journal at theradicalsecular.com. Okay, let's get into the t-shirts. Joe, what have you got today?
Well, I wanted to wear this shirt again because I think the show today is really about humans and humanity. And so it just seemed very appropriate.
Yeah, it's perfect, Joe. Right. And it's interesting, right, because it sort of ties into the reason why I wore my t-shirt today. And I was looking through the outline earlier, and I saw that you had mentioned the United Federation of Planets, and that is actually the shirt that I'm wearing today, my UFP shirt.
Yes.
Discovery vintage. And, you know, I brought it, I wore it today because, first of all, it's interesting that it happens to just like really connect with the shirt that you're wearing, because I wore it today because of the such stark lack of humanity that I have sometimes interact with personally, say online or in my life, people that I've known. And of course, behind the screen, it all becomes easier to be a complete asshole. But
right.
But there are people out there who are just like this, right? And so often this ties into toxic masculinity, and that's some sort of what we're going to be talking about later on in the show. So anyway, good choice of shirt. It seems like we were sort of on the same wavelength, right?
Seems like it.
Yeah. Anyway, so I want to give you an opportunity, Joe, to discuss the article that you wrote recently.
Okay.
Give us just a little bit of a gist of what's going on with that.
Sure. Thanks, Christophe. I appreciate that. I mean, I wrote the article thinking about my role at the Radical Secular and what we're doing. And I wanted to kind of lay out in my own mind at first what the meaning of all of it is and what's important. And so the article really talks about power, and it talks about self-reflection and tries to tie the two things together. And I think that the left and progressives and liberals on that side of the spectrum tend to shy away from power. We associate power with oppression, the powerful preying on the less powerful, and we have a distaste for it by and large. And unfortunately, the other side does not. And power is necessary. Now, I think we need to be better at using power. That's one of the things I wanted to talk about. And the other thing is I think we can avoid some of the abuses of power and use it more wisely if we do link it with self-reflection and an understanding of ourselves, our motivation, and what our purpose is. Now, I know that a lot of these articles, sometimes they come out forcefully and talk about what's wrong with the world, which is fine. I think we need to do that. That's a part of it. But I also wanted to think about what we could do, right? To have some actionable things in our lives and in our project to make the world a better place. And I hope that I accomplished some of that. What did you think?
That well said, Joe. And I think that I loved the article because I really thought that the fact, like you say, brings together this importance of self-reflection and being and understanding who I am in relation to other people. And I think there's a lot of range for that, right? There is thinking it's the people that deny that human beings are animals. But it's also about like how our sort of our complex interactions with other people. All of these things, I think, are reflecting on that, being clear-eyed about that is critical. And it's really critical if we're going to use power. And we have to use power, Joe, because we are losing this fight. We liberals, progressives, we are losing. We see it all around the world, right? We see the backsliding towards authoritarianism, or we see it everywhere. So if we are going to get back in this fight as progressives, we have to understand power. But power does corrupt. It really, really does. That's the problem with it. So that self-introspection becomes super, super important. And I really loved the article because it really encapsulated how I think about this project, right? I don't think it can't just be about pointing out what's wrong. It has to be about identifying how we move forward. And I think that is what makes it, that's what makes it aspirational. I think that is what keeps it interesting in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. And I think we're going to do a little bit of that today too, I hope. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. But before we get to that, we're going to talk about the next chapter, this chapter that we're now living in, of the pandemic saga. And I'm talking, of course, about the new COVID variant known as Omicron. And the fact is that we don't know too much about it right now, and we don't know whether it will outcompete the deadly Delta variant, although that is changing. Reuters reports, quote, the Omicron coronavirus variant detected in southern Africa could be the most likely candidate to displace the highly contagious Delta variant. If Omicron proves even more transmissible than the Delta variant, it could lead to a sharp spike in infections that could put pressure on hospitals. Scientists should know within 4 weeks to what extent Omicron can evade the immunity generated by vaccines or prior infection, and whether it leads to worse clinical symptoms than other variants. Anecdotal accounts by doctors who have treated the South African COVID-19 patients say Omicron appears to be producing mild symptoms, including a dry cough, fever, and night sweats. So, Joe, why shouldn't we just laugh off this so-called Omicron variant? Because we know it's just another mainstream media ploy to usher in a new era of communism. So that where the real Americans are lorded over by feminazis and transgender soy boys. Am I right or am I right?
Dude, you're so right. This whole COVID thing is left-wing bullshit fabricated by global elites who love to have sex with children. And eat
many elites.
Right? So don't believe anything I'm going to say about it. I'm just a sheeple grazing in Bill Gates' pasture. That's all I'm saying.
That's it.
Anyhow, I prepared for this show by looking at some studies and reading some articles and seeing what the experts are saying across the board. And, this is changing by the minute. Every time I look at something different, and it really is every day seems to require reassessment of the situation. I don't think that's going to change for a while. But let me just start with like Omicron. It's the B1.1.1529 variant that was discovered in South Africa around November 11th or so. Now, it doesn't mean it began in South Africa. The reason the WHO uses Greek letters is for the very reason of not making these false associations with countries that can lead to all kinds of problems and biases. So we can move beyond that. And it's circulating across the world now and across the United States. I think it's in 6 states the last time I checked. I don't think there's a question that it's going to reach everywhere. It's quite startling how fast it's spreading in South Africa. And now think about it, South Africa, about 40% of the population there has caught coronavirus, right? Has caught the disease. And about 30% have been at least partially vaccinated. So we're getting up there in the herd immunity area, but the number of cases is soaring. And hospitalizations and deaths, now they lag. So we have to wait a few weeks until we find that out. And we should look for that. But they also probably will begin to soar as well. Now, there is a possibility that this is a milder type of disease, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. That would be great news if it is. And although I would caution not to put too much faith on the first anecdotal cases that you've heard that it's a mild disease. I hope that's true, but way too early. A recent South African study, in fact, a good one from the Institute of Health of South Africa, their main government agency, looked at about 28 20.8 million people who caught COVID-19, just naturally caught it. And then how many of them caught it again? This was over the last several months. So not vaccinated people. It shows Omicron to be much more able to reinfect people that have developed a natural immunity. It found that people who have been infected once have a higher chance of catching COVID again than people who have never been infected. So,
holy shit.
So there's this weird thing that can happen with antibodies. Potentially this is happening here. And Delta and other earlier variants did not show any of this. So this is new. Now, on the bright side, it's rare for virulence, the severity of disease, to increase in the mutation. It doesn't happen very often. Generally, they stay the same or get weaker. So it's not likely that Omicron has gotten worse in that regard. However, we'll have to see. Even if the virulence is not higher than before, if it stays roughly about the same, this is not good. If Omicron is significantly milder, on the other hand, this is very good news because it means that it will literally act as a natural vaccine against Delta and other more deadly variants. So again, we'll have to see. The big question is how effective the existing vaccines are. An effective vaccine should do a bunch of things. First, it should prevent infection, it should prevent transmission, and third, it should lower the virulence, the death rate and hospitalization rate. Now, it does these things through antibodies and other T cells and other parts of the immune system. It's very complex. How the vaccine will interact with each strain, it takes time to learn, right? You can't really get that in the lab. You can the lab can suggest things, but real life really is what you need. We're going to find out. And the studies are going to take time, but there are already some have come out that are telling us a few things, and it doesn't look good to me, honestly. It does seem like we will see a drop in effectiveness based on what we know so far for the vaccines. Now, again, we don't know for sure, but it's suggesting that. There was a study about natural immunity I just talked about, does suggest that if it can cause reinfection in people who have natural immunity, it may also cause reinfection in people who have immunity from the vaccine. Uncertain yet. Genetic sequencing, however, suggests the same thing. Omicron is very highly mutated in ways that theoretically, in the laboratory, could interfere with the vaccine, as well as natural immunity. So Omicron has about 50 plus mutations to the virus, 32 to the spike protein, and 10 to the very aspects that the virus that's implicated in its ability to infect people. So in comparison, Delta has 17, 7, and 2 mutations. So it's a lot more mutated than anything we've seen so far. And it seems we'll have to rely on what works with all variants more than ever. Possibly some antiviral medications that are coming online will be very helpful. Certainly social distancing, mask wearing, testing, all of those measures will need to be beefed up. And, there's so much fatigue associated with this now. People are just tired of living in a pandemic situation. And we'll see what happens with that. There's also, Christophe, things to do as an individual. Like, yes, of course, you got to follow public health guidelines and mandates. But also, I think it's valuable to improve your immunity. And you can do that by taking vitamin D, for example. And that's meets the standard of scientific studies. That's been shown to be efficacious in that way. Also, just things like taking care of yourself, sleeping well, having a good diet, meditating, exercising, all of these things will improve your chances to some degree of having a better outcome if you do get infected. And they're worth doing. They're worth doing even if we didn't have a pandemic, but they're definitely worth doing now.
Absolutely, Joe. And that was super useful for me. And it sounds like, we don't know that much, but what we do know, but that's changing. We're learning more and more and more. And we should expect probably something kind of similar to Delta, right? I mean, although it sounds like in some ways it's worse because of its ability to sort of go over the walls of immunity, it sounds like. And that is sort of terrifying, right? I mean, so as you're talking, I'm thinking, about the fatigue, right? We've all been in this for a long ass time. Even those of us like, who are lucky enough to live in places like the United States and in Europe, and have been vaccinated. We are still living in this sort of pandemic era. And so I can only imagine what that's like when you're living day in, day out, in a much more sort of difficult environment. So I totally understand that. Do you think that we are on a road toward basically endless mutations? Like will there be a W virus coming up, right?
I don't know. I don't know, but I would probably say no. Because I think if you look at history, like let's say other pandemics, they tend to run, spike, and then dissipate and become endemic. So I would say that this is probably going to do the same. I just don't know how long it will take and how many iterations we're going to see.
Right.
Who knows?
Who knows? So did you say endemic there at the end? Like it becomes endemic after a while? Yes. So can you explain what that means? Like, what do you mean? But what does it mean that a pandemic becomes endemic?
Well, that it becomes one of the baseline diseases that people just generally get, but they're not so severe that it's going to be as disruptive as it was in the pandemic phase. For example, like a lot of flus are endemic. They just keep coming back. But we deal with it, right, in society. We know this flu. People get flu. We deal with it. And the same thing could happen and should happen with COVID.
Gotcha. So it sounds to me that my instinct is a little bit wrong, right? So my instinct is to answer that question by saying, yes, we will have endless mutations. And the reason why we will have endless mutations is because we won't get this under control. And the reason why we cannot get the pandemic under control is because nations are hoarding vaccines. Now, that is a narrative that is like natural to me as a progressive and someone who is skeptical of corporate power and of borders for that matter. Sure. And so that's why I'm wearing the damn shirt. Right. But it sounds like I'm wrong. And so
no, you're not wrong.
Go ahead.
No, you're not wrong. I think all those things matter a lot. I just think it will take a lot longer for this to become endemic without doing the right stuff. So I mean, rather than taking a year or two, it might take 20 years. I don't know. I mean, it's really so you're not really wrong per se.
I see.
I mean, mutations are very rare. And the reason why they happen, at least consequential ones, I should say, mutations that have consequences for all of us, because mutations aren't, they're common, but the ones that actually coordinate into being something like a Delta variant or Omicron. And the reason why that happens is it's just a numbers game, Christophe. I mean, there are up to 1 trillion virus particles in an infected person. 1 trillion.
That's insane.
Right? Up to. So even if it's rare, if you have 1 trillion shots, chances, right? Now take that number and then multiply it by the number of humans who are infected on the planet. And man, that number is big, right?
Yeah.
And the sheer massive number of existing virus particles simply overwhelms the rare factor. And the more people that are infected, the higher the chances of a meaningful mutation popping up like Omicron. So there's your answer, right?
Interesting.
You're right. Absolutely right. The fact that we're hoarding vaccines is implicated in making this a lot worse.
Right. It's part of the problem.
Yeah. I mean, you got this whole first world primacy thing, right? It's part of our history. The first world has dominated the rest of the world for centuries. And in this case, it's making the pandemic worse. Because first world countries that have resources are hoarding the vaccines. Corporations that are making these vaccines want to make a profit. Governments in developed nations want to keep it, for themselves. And they are giving some away, but it's really been token so far, if you ask me.
Yeah.
So it's making things worse for the very countries that are doing the bad things, that are hoarding the vaccines, right? For us.
Right.
We're not doing ourselves any favor because we're going to keep having more and more of these variants. And, COVID is nasty. Look, it really does mutate quite a lot, right? More than people thought it would. Now, so we have normalized these conditions and expectations about humans that arose from the European domination of the planet, colonialism. We simply accept today wildly different expectations about human dignity, who should get it, who shouldn't, human rights, and we base that on place of birth, race, class, and all kinds of things, right, that privilege some over others. And in the end, this stuff really is going to bite us in the ass, ultimately. Pandemics like this are a reminder that inequality has great consequences. To treat ourselves, we need to treat all. That's basically the United Federation of Planets right there, right? And of course, yeah, we have to take care of everyone. And of course, this applies not just to pandemics and viruses, it applies to pretty much everything. Alleviate poverty and everyone benefits, not just the poor. I hope, like your shirt says, that at some point humanity figures this out.
I really hope so too. I really do. And by the way, really well said. And this, we are a global community, and the faster that we get our act together and realize this, right, the better off we will all be, like you say, right? There is so many ways in which this is probably, like, there's so many ways in which this plays out. I mean, people don't want to, universal basic income, right, is a great example of how you alleviate poverty, right? And how you create a floor, right, under which no one ever has to fall, right? And people think, oh, well, then you're going to get lazy people and people are not going to work. And to some extent, that's true. I mean, some people won't, but not most people, right? Most people want to do stuff. That's what most people want to do. But what I'm getting at is this, conservatives don't seem to understand that, like, you can't just wall yourself off in your house and let everyone else out there die. Like, that's not realistic. Eventually, those people are going to come over your wall, right? Like I ask this to conservatives frequently, which is like, so what are you going to do with all the losers, right? If you just don't care, ravage capitalism, go through, right? How are you going to deal with the losers? And eventually this will actually touch you. And I think that this is a great example of what we're dealing with right now. Is now we're dealing with the Omicron variant, which can overcome our walls, right? Yeah. It doesn't care that you've been vaccinated, right? Absolutely. So that means, like, we have, because of our unwillingness to share, essentially, right? The capitalism, the profit, and to what you were saying before, this idea that this custom that we become, that's become normalized, that some people on the planet just have way worse lives than others, and that's just okay, thanks to colonialism, right? But this is the sort of thing that actually touches people that might get middle class, average Westerners to pay attention. It's like, no, we really do have to get this thing under control, or else we're never going to be able to go on vacation again. And frankly, I might even be able to leave my house because of the Omicron variant, perhaps. So, like, again, hopefully, right? Hopefully. Yeah.
And the difference, aptly put, Christophe, the difference is between, let's say, the pandemic and climate change. The pandemic is happening real time. People can actually see the dynamics very clearly. And so maybe that will change attitudes, and we'll see. Let's hope. And by the way, we can say the same thing about cyber warfare and these emerging, like, AI technologies and all kinds of reasons why we have to work at the planet now as a united world. We really do, because these problems are global and they affect everyone. And it's a different world now, like unlike ever before in that regard.
It really, really is. We can't escape. No matter, you can pretend that it's not global, right? You can pretend that we are all individual nation states whose lives don't interact with each other. I mean, it's like, it's such a libertarian perspective, right? This idea that, like, I am just this island, right? And it is so silly and unrealistic. I mean, you have to be, like, actively ignore evidence to come to that conclusion. You have to, because I mean, everything we do impacts other people. And like you say, at this point, if there was a time, maybe World War II, before World War II is the last time that you really could be an island as a country, right? Where you perhaps,
to a lesser extent, yes.
To a lesser extent. Yeah. Right. Whereas now, it is impossible to it's impossible to overlook the interconnectedness, even just business alone, right? We are incredibly connected. So let's hope, man. United Federation of Planets.
Or at least a United Federation of this planet to start.
Yeah, right. Let's just start small. Right, let's start small. So look, well, let's. Do you have anything else you want to say about the coronavirus, about any of that, Joe? I don't want to sort of jump off it if we.
Only just to stay, interested and mindful about what's going to happen. I think it could get very interesting.
Yeah, I think so too. I am worried. I mean, I'll tell you what, you talked about fatigue, Joe. Like when I heard the new variant, there was a point where just like, oh, are you fucking kidding me? Like, and I'm a guy who is, I think, pretty realistic about this stuff. I don't think that I thought, logically that this was now all over, right? Because everyone was vaccinated. Right. Any hopes of that were definitely dashed when, first of all, people refused to take the vaccine, for one, and also just that, right? Like these variants. And just when I realized when it became clear exactly what we're talking about is that even if we are in our, citadel vaccinated, if the rest of the world is not vaccinated, this just doesn't end. So that just that exhaustion, I can totally identify with that. It was just like, you got to be kidding me. Here we go again,
Yeah, I mean, vaccination rates in sub-Saharan Africa are running 5%. South Africa is high at 28% or something like that. That's
it's crazy. And we're going to talk a little bit more about South Africa, interestingly. But I want to move on to our next topic now, which is, broadly speaking, navigating difficult and or toxic relationships, the kind of relationships that are difficult or impossible to avoid. So think holidays. Many people are obliged to negotiate these kinds of relationships in connection with the holiday season, which, at least according to capitalism, is very much upon us. Now, I've got fatherhood on the brain for reasons that will become clear in a moment, so I'll start the conversation there. And again, it's interesting that that the Omicron discussion revolves so heavily around Southern Africa and South Africa, because as you know, Joe, my father lived in the Johannesburg area until very recently. Mm-hmm. He was actually of Cameroonian descent, my father, but he moved to the United States in the late 1960s to attend Princeton University. Louis Defoe, my father, was in many ways very, very smart and very, very talented and resilient. Can you imagine coming to the United States and going to Princeton in 1968 as a black man from Africa? I just can't. I sometimes try and fathom the environments that my parents had to deal with, because both of my parents are very highly educated and at a very minimum are very talented. But they're black, and they were going into these schools and into these environments in the 60s and 70s. And, I talk about microaggressions in the 90s or whatever. I mean, I'm sure there was more macroaggressions and to a certain extent, it sounds like, you as with an immigrant background also probably have a little bit of, I'm sure your dad and your family coming to the United States has probably had similar challenges.
To some extent, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, I say was as in the past tense because my father passed away about 3 weeks ago. Stage 4 prostate cancer did him in quite abruptly, as it does. It was all very sad. I visited my father in South Africa this past October. And when I left his house that final day to catch my flight back to the United States, I did so with the knowledge that I'd almost certainly seen my father for the last time. It was super, super intense. He died just several weeks after I saw him last. And I am super, super glad that I visited him before then. I mean, really, it couldn't have been closer. I mean, we're talking like several weeks later, he was gone. And interestingly, when we were there, there was a lot of hope that things were getting better. And I mean, like, to be fair, this is also like, these folks are very much into the church and stuff like that. So there's kind of a worldview that is perhaps not 100% steeped in reality. So you can really believe kind of whatever you want to believe. But they were upbeat and optimistic. And then I always say this too. It's like, what did I expect them to be all like morose and depressed? I mean, the man's alive, right? So anyway, the point is that like I saw him, I talked to him, I spent time with him. And so it was really, really jarring to hear that he was gone. Now, like I was saying, Joe, your father is a first generation immigrant as well, right?
Yeah. Well, first, all my love to you, Christophe. I lost my dad several years ago, and I can relate. It's one of those difficult and clarifying times in life, my father brought us all here to the U.S. in 1973 from Sicily. We were sponsored by his brother. That's how immigration works in the U.S. for now. There were 8 of us. Well, there were 6 of us came over, and then 2 more were born. 8 of us. My father worked extremely long hours to make ends meet. My mother stayed home. We lived a very modest life, but a good life, as a result of all their efforts. My parents were, did their job, very well. The cost was, though, that I never saw my father. None of us did. We grew up without him in many ways, even though we lived in the same home. He was just working all the time. The relationship my father and I had was that occasionally he would build things around the house on the weekends, and I was his little helper. He built his crazy bathroom, 2 of them actually.
Oh, wow.
And he did it on his own without really knowing much about building bathrooms, so you can imagine. But he was smart. I learned a lot. Anyway, he had a temper, and he could be very critical of me at times when I messed up, when I did mess up. But I still treasure those moments. They're basically all I have from my childhood. I did have a chance to get to know him as an adult, thankfully, and he was quite a character, my father, and a very compassionate man in many ways. He was a lifelong atheist, by the way.
Yeah, I find that fascinating.
Yeah. And he was not shy about it. Yeah. In the end, I helped take care of him at the last few years as he died pretty slowly of leukemia. And it was his job that killed him, I think. He worked into his mid-70s because he had to, money-wise. Sure. And he developed this rare form of leukemia, I think because of the constant exposure to carbide dust and other metals from his work as a machinist, And, I think that it's important for us to have stories about our deceased parents, to talk about them and talk about their lives, good and bad.
Sure. Yeah. All right. Now, Joe, how old were you when your father passed?
Well, I would have been my early 50s.
Gotcha.
52, maybe, something like that.
Gotcha. Yes, I mean, so you have a lot of brothers and sisters. So it seems like, it could range from your dad was like 20 years older than you to your dad being like 30 years older than you, right? Like based on the number of kids.
19 years difference between my oldest, 19 years. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. It's wild. It sounds, thanks for sharing that, by the way, because,
sure.
It's kind of a personal thing to share. It was, and I don't want to go down the whole, there's a reason why I'm bringing up my father, although I guess it is in some way cathartic to talk about it, but there is a punchline at the end of this or a question at the end of this, but just to dip into it momentarily, you and I talked a little bit about this before the show, and what you said, that it was sort of enlightening or not enlightening, but I can't remember the language you used to describe the experience of losing your father. It was a learning experience. It sounds like it was a very powerful experience. And I think what was interesting for me is, and I'm going to talk about this in a few minutes, right? Like, my dad and I didn't get along. In fact, we were more or less sort of estranged when I discovered that he was sick back in July. And my father's illness certainly didn't magically bridge that chasm right between us. And so within several days of being at his house in South Africa, I was reminded precisely of why we aren't part of each other's lives. But that said, being there and experiencing his world was super powerful for me. Being in Africa in general, given that I was born in Africa and I'm of African descent, really put him into a context that and the way he was living there too. He was living sort of like this African patriarch kind of life, right? And I'm like, holy shit, this is what he always wanted. Like, right, this, and now in retrospect, looking at my own life, my own experience with him, I can be like, yeah, you know what? Like, I see that that's what he was going for at the time as an American kid growing up in America. That kind of classic old school, authoritarian style fatherhood didn't work for me at all.
Right.
But I understand what he was doing. And like you say, it's important to tell stories about his life and to remember him as he was. I'm not going to make anything up, but there was a lot of amazing things about his character. I can see him in myself as I get older, right? Increasingly, I see him in me. And so, again, just a really powerful experience. And because my father and I didn't have a close relationship, certainly for the last 20 years that we were both alive, I don't miss him, right? We talked about this at the beginning of the show. Like, it's not like he was part of my life and suddenly he's gone, but nevertheless, there's something super powerful about the experience, and it has been challenging in so many ways. But anyway, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of talking about my relationship with my father. That's a lot. But I do want to. I say all of this because I want to highlight a conflict here, right? A conundrum, and that is, how does one feel about a person who is an ultra-conservative religious zealot or other kind of bad ideas, let's say, and who is dying a painful death and is also my father or your uncle or your mom, right? Like, how do you deal with a person that you don't really like that much objectively, but you have in some sense an obligation to love?
Wow, that's a great question. Also a very thorny question.
Very thorny.
We have sort of talked about this conundrum in the show in a roundabout way here and there. It's good to kind of tackle it more directly here. How to deal with a relative pushing destructive ideas and practices, or a friend, by someone close. Well, how to feel, first of all. I don't want to sound like a pop psychologist, but in truth, there is something to the idea that there are no shoulds around feelings. Feelings are feelings. They show up at your door. Hello, I'm bitterness. You got a place on your couch for a few days? No way, man. The last time I let you in, you stayed for 2 years. If only you could say that and shut the door, right? Sure. But you can't, right? Once the door is open, that dude's coming in. And the only thing we can do is deal with it, right? Figure out a way to deal with our feelings. So how we should feel is not really the question as much as what to do with those feelings. How to put them in some kind of healthier, more constructive perspective. And how to deal, I think we start by being mindful of our principles, what we believe in, alleviating suffering, compassion, justice, all these things. And being mindful of those things. Is there a way to be compassionate to an individual with destructive ideas that you care about? That is, the ideas themselves are leading to suffering, though. So while at the same time, can we also be compassionate of that? The people for whom these ideas are hurting them, right? Yeah. And by the way, by compassion, I mean in the sense that I'm talking about, that it extends to action, to being the right kind of person, right? That's the most compassionate act you can do, is to be the right kind of person for this world. As far as love, love is not something we do. It's something that happens. It shows up at your door just like anything else. And it just is. And yet we still need to decide what to do when someone we love or even like, right, is being a true asshole. Right. Any close relationship is going to test us in one way or another, even with people who are generally kind and decent people. As adults, we learn to make compromises and adjust in the relationship. All humans are flawed, hence all relationships are going to be flawed to a greater or lesser degree. The question is, when do we choose to walk away? When do we leave? I think each case deserves the dignity of its own merits. I do not believe like there's in zero tolerance policies in general. I do not believe in dualistic thinking. That applies to this. It applies to the necessity of choosing what to do when someone you care about is acting in destructive ways. It's incredibly hard. Incredibly hard. It's one of those main life challenges, right up there with how to deal with loss. Giving someone advice is something to do with great consideration and humility. That's what I would like to start with.
Yeah, really well said, Joe. And, first of all, dealing with these feelings, right? Like the people that are closest to us are the people who kindle the most harsh feelings, right? The most, not even harsh, but intense, True. Right? I mean, from love to frustration, right? I can be more frustrated with my wife, for example, than probably maybe anyone on the planet in like a hot flash, right?
Yeah.
But it goes away very quickly. But we're so close. Our lives are so intertwined, right? So I know every little detail. Meanwhile, someone that I barely know, it's hard for them to really piss me off, frankly, right? Like, I mean, I can be walking down the street and bump into somebody. Like, I mean, I'm not the kind of person who's going to fly off the handle, right? Like, I mean, I have to have something committed with the person, whether it be ideas or just length of time together to get that pissed off. But the difference is when people are doing things to hurt other people. That is such an important point that you brought up there, Joe. And that is, I think, the thorny nature of this, right? How do you, because I can say to myself, right, first of all, a great way to deal with this stuff is I find meditation, right? That's really important. The reflection in general, right? Because what I found as I was going through these last several weeks of, pretty, very, very intense emotions was that because of persistent meditation practice, and again, I'm not sitting here trying to sell meditation to everybody out there. If you don't like it, don't do it. But I'm just saying from my own experience is that I was able to put my feelings into context, right? I was able to say like, yeah, this feeling that I'm having, first of all, I was able to see the feeling as separate from sort of myself, right? And also being able to sort of realize that like, look, under these circumstances, it is perfectly reasonable for you to feel bad, upset, hurt, lost, whatever, however these feelings are. And, so don't be surprised that you're having these feelings. Right. So I think having that sort of reflection is really, really, really important. And that can help anybody, I think, get through the difficult, thorny areas in this relationship. But where one draws that line, like you say, where does one say, all right, you know what? You are out of my life. I cannot be part of this. Or maybe not like completely out of my life, but like we cannot have a close relationship. This relationship has become toxic, right? Even though we are bound together by whatever, we've been friends a long time, or you're my father, or you're my son, or whatever, right? We have to be, I think it is important that we're willing to draw that line somewhere, because then you really do get in these places where I am, for example, putting up with, let's say, I don't know, this is not my father in my relationship, but emotional abuse, let's say, right? Because this is family,
Right.
So I think that's really problematic. I just think it's really, really challenging. It is.
Good points. I mean, it's very challenging. And I think that's one thing we have to remember always. This is not easy stuff.
Right. No easy answers, right? It's not like an on-off switch where you can say like every time in this situation, for example, it's really easy and tempting. And I think I fell into this trap early on, in like 2015 and 2016, which is like, if this person is a Trump supporter, then they are per se out of my life. And that is actually still largely true, but it's not like an on-off switch. It's not like just because you are a Trump supporter, you are out of my life, right? So like, for example, my dad was not a big Trump supporter, but he would have voted for Trump if you were in his entire religion. It's like that they are Trump believers, right? But that didn't keep me from going to see my dad. It did keep him at relative arm's length in a lot of ways, right? Because it was sort of reflective of the problems between us. But it wasn't like he was literally out of my life, right? And I think that is important to go with that on a case-by-case basis.
Right. Oh, good. Yeah, absolutely. You do. I mean, like right now, I don't think I have anybody I'm interacting with who's a Trump supporter. So it's easy for me to say, do this and do that. But I think it's you have to be considerate. You have to think about your ethics. You have to think about what's important to you, and then make a decision based on that deliberation and thoughtfulness, right?
Right. And also, by the way, it doesn't have to be like forever, right?
No.
There could be a period where I'm just like, look, I cannot fucking deal with you right now. Right. Like this is for whatever. And by the way, and you know, I've had relationships with people in my life very close to me where I've had to take breaks essentially. Right. Because I'm like, dude,
sure.
like I can't deal with this toxicity. Right. And maybe I can come back to this in a year or two or whatever. I wouldn't say this out loud, but just sort of like what I'm feeling and thinking. Maybe I can come back to this. Maybe I can't. But right now, I'm not going to be in a position where I'm being, say, taken advantage of or just associating and with really people who believe really bad things. You know, every Trump supporter is 90. These people they love their family. Their buddies think they're great, right? You know, so it's not like, because we think that people that are that do shitty things are all like these evil people with their tented fingers going ha 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 ha. But that's not at all how it works at all. They're just normal people that look like you and me, but they're contributing to a huge problem and human suffering. And it's like, wow, how do you deal with that? You know, and there is no easy answer. You know, I didn't ask this question expecting that we would come to a hard answer here. I really just wanted to talk about, well, that deliberative process in a sense.
Yeah, and I think it's important for people to know that this is a challenge. It's not easy for anybody, really. Mm-hmm. And that there are others like you thinking about this, processing this, trying to make sense of it. And that's what we can do for each other. We can sort of like help each other, you know, work through this, because that's what we need to do. We need to work through it. We don't have a choice.
Exactly right, man. That's exactly right. And I think another interesting area of this conversation is, and I think about things, I tend to think about things in terms of evolutionary psychology, right? So and again, I have been, and I'm looking at this through the prism of my father, obviously, because of the where I'm at in my life right at this moment. But, you know, a lot of times, I hear a lot about conflicts in father-son relationships. There's a lot of them, right? Sure. There's almost like can be like a rivalry, in some sense, right?
Yeah.
How much do you ascribe to those conflicts to evolutionary psychology, and you know, in terms of father-son relationships? You're also a father, incidentally.
Yes, I am. 23-year-old.
Mm-hmm. So how do you think about that? I mean, like, I get, you know.
Let me start with like our favorite topic here, Star Trek.
Yes, perfect.
The show resonates with us. You guys know that. You're our listener. You know that we are kind of wacky about Star Trek. You and I, Krista, are both great fans of DS9 in particular. Do you remember that show about Worf, the Klingon, who was seeking out his father in a Romulan prison camp who might be alive? The show was about the importance of parent-child relationship, the father and son relationships, but parents and children in general. Great episode. I think it was a double feature. And all those close ties are so important at a really deep psychological level. They're so central to who we are. We can't really ignore them, right? This is why it's so hard.
Right.
Yeah. To be honest, Christophe, in terms of the sociobiology, evolutionary psychology, I have some qualms about the whole narrative that's coming out of that. Not so much within the science itself, but in larger society. Not that I reject it, I don't. Of course, it's a main factor in human behavior. And the evidence is the evidence. However, rushing to that narrative as it's being done so much means that we can deny and ignore the things we have control over. Culture, institutions, relationships. I mean, I don't have a lot of control about my genetics. Not yet. I mean, maybe in the future I will. Right? I'm an asshole due to my chromosomes. Okay, where's the beer? Let's move on, right? I mean, that doesn't cut it. I have a mind which is subject, at least in theory, to some control, and that's where the work is, and that's where the accountability is. Academia, especially the humanities and much of social sciences, radically moved away from biology as a model of human relations after the horrors of World War II. And there was a reason for that. That hard essentialism about human nature was a centerpiece of colonialist ideology and certainly shaped the world in ways that allowed for fascism and Nazism to emerge. the race is a social construction idea that came out of that post-war legacy is a good example of how our ideas changed as a reaction to that horror, right? Mm-hmm. Likewise, gender is also a social construction. Hence, maleness is a social construction. And fatherhood is a social construction, right? When we look at socio-biological models, we must do so in that context, or we really risk losing a lot. Okay, so it's true that the postmodern anti-essentialist reaction went too far. And we've talked about this in this show. Mm-hmm. In some academic circles, it went too far, and certainly in popular culture, it went too far. Everything started to be seen as a social construction, all of reality, not just a matter of identity. And that was just crazy, right? So evolutionary biology is one of those modes of thoughts that's moving us back towards a more objective view of reality around humans and their behavior, which is a good thing, right? It's healthy. It's to be expected. But sometimes I just fear that it's going too far. I see a lot of destructive essentialism coming back into the conversation. Larger conversations about identity, even on the left. And of course, the right could not be happier about this.
Oh, they love that.
It suits their narrative beautifully. So we need an intelligent and creative balance of understanding human nature, right? Mm-hmm. Yes, there are biological imperatives, per se, not nearly as many as we thought there were throughout most of modern history, before World War II, certainly. The idea that arose post-war was that most of social life is constructed. And I think that remains a valid and important idea. That's my view, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of evolutionary biology theory about social relations can create very essentialist and static beliefs about social relations. Doesn't necessarily have to. And in fact, a lot of the scientists are really careful not to do that. But as that narrative breaks into the larger non-scientific world, that tends to happen. And it's encouraged to happen by actors on the right that want to see the world that way. I'm aggressive because I have this level of testosterone in my body. Because my brain structure is in this configuration, I do these toxic things. Okay, done. Where's my beer? Right? It's done. I mean, that may be true to some extent, but we have to ask what else is true, right? Also keep in mind that when it comes to evolutionary change, we are talking about long stretches of time, right? Very long stretches of time. It's very easy to misapply the theory, and a lot of people do. Right? Think about how attitudes on gay marriage changed so rapidly. Think about how all the progress engendered by the civil rights movement and women's rights, how quickly, in relative terms, right? Human history, those things happen. They happen in a relative blink of an eye in comparison. When we're talking about this course of time in genetics, right? It's a blink of an eye. So how much can we attribute to genetics about all these really meaningful changes? Not much. Right?
Yeah.
Why father relationships are important have a lot more to do with culture, in my opinion. A point in fact, there are and have been many societies where the extended family is far more important than biological parents. In the village where I lived in the Andes, grandparents were the center of the family, especially grandmothers, right? It was very different sort of arrangement in modern Western society's nuclear family that's relegated as the norm. So if we essentialize these relationships, whatever they may be, it does damage. The father thing feeds on old hierarchical narratives. It denies meaning to children raised by single-parent women. It rationalizes bad behavior. It removes accountability, and so forth. So on the other hand, okay, I don't want to go too far because we should not be blind to the nature of biology either. If there are clear mechanisms discovered about biology and behavior, then we should pay attention to them and then act accordingly. Do the right things. But mechanisms, not simply correlations. Mechanisms are required. The fact alone that men are more violent, e.g. toxic masculinity and all that, is not enough to conclude that it is essentially a biological phenomenon. Right? That's the lesson. I was talking to my wife about this, kind of running through some of this show. I was going to say, she's an anthropologist, and so she knows a lot about this stuff, a lot more than I do. And so she helped me sort through some of it. And she also mentioned that there are feminist father-son relationships analyses that come way back from the 70s and 80s and 90s that take a very different approach to the father-son relationship. Much of Western civilization was shaped and mediated by property rights and inheritance dynamics. You talk about that tension there, right? Those very long-held patterns, I mean, they go back many centuries, And they embed themselves in tradition, in literature, in films. And many of those things from our past still resonate today to some extent and shape the psychology of men today and shape the father-son relationship. It's just one example of how culture can shape things over the course of time that look very much like natural and biological things, but they're not necessarily. And that's just one example. There are many more.
Yeah. Really, thank you for that, Joe. That was really helpful because, right, it's important that we don't conflate biology with just hardened cultural norms, right? I mean, right, I think one of the biggest flashpoints in our evolutionary history as a culture, at least, is the agricultural revolution, right? Like that is a real change in a lot of different things, but it's really easy to say that, like, right, gender roles, for example, are natural, right? This is natural for women just because the culture is so a patriarchal culture has dominated most of the world for so long. And what ends up happening then is that, right, this is a great example of this is women in the military, right? Because people say, right, like, oh, women can't carry as much, or women can't fight as well, or whatever. And even though you might look at statistics and say women are X, but it doesn't follow that they are X because of their biology, right? It's like, well, of course, women have not been certainly in Western culture, haven't been fighting wars for forever. So we can't expect that this generation of women suddenly is going to be on par, or, right? You play video games at all?
Sure.
So you know how, right, there's always women in video games. They're always in the fighting games. They're always scantily clothed and everything like that. But I'm always taken aback by, like, their fighting style is a different kind of fighting style, right? It's not like big ogre, like, attack strong. It ends up it's usually fast. It's maneuverable, right? And it's basically using the way women are to affect.
Right.
To fight, right? And what I'm trying to get at is that, right, because we have had generations of women not ever fighting, right? The women perhaps haven't developed that. That has not been nurtured in our culture. That hasn't been developed in our culture, whereas men have been, right? Have been socialized. And that's not to ignore biological differences, but I think that it's important, as you say, to not conflate those two aspects.
Yeah, that's a good way of saying it. Yeah.
You know,
if you live in the third world for a while and you see how much women can carry, they can carry a lot, man. You don't believe what I've seen a couple of times is young women with a baby in their back and a pickaxe at the same time breaking rocks, right? Yeah. I mean, it's just like, so there's sort of this cult of womanhood thing still kind of lingering around here, you know?
Right. So yeah, that is, I think that is important. And so I'm glad that this conversation sort of went in this way of this sort of nature versus nurture sort of discussion, because I think that one of the things that that we talked about at the top of the show or earlier in the show with power, and now we're talking about it here in some sense with biology, is that, like, right, the swing away, the leftists sort of swing away from biology as an answer to some questions, or as at least informing the debate, right? That was a swing this far, way over on the pendulum. And there has to be a place where we are, just like power, using this information, using these in a way that's reasonable, right? In a way that is tempered by compassion and with reason. And I think that there is a little bit of a bridge there between those two things.
Quite right. I think that's great. That's a really solid point you're making. We have to kind of figure out the right logical and evidentiary balance to all of it. Because, if the evidence says this, you got to really follow the evidence. I mean, that's part of being, a reasoned human being, right?
For sure.
And I mean, the left, there was a political dimension to it because the world went through so much horror. It really scarred us. Mm-hmm. And we really shied away from looking at biology, right? In academia and in other parts of society. And And it was a good thing mostly, because then we got us to look at culture, which is really critically important. But there is a downside that it might have gone too far. And now we're sort of trying to navigate a better spot. As long as we don't go too far again the other way. That's what I'm worried about.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, what we're talking about here at the Radical Secular a lot of the time, and we're not trying to split the baby, right? It's not like if it's the like whatever's in the middle. I hate that analogy.
Right.
It's like
Bad.
just because in the middle, it's in the middle between two ideas, that it must be the right idea. No,
not at all.
It's definitely not. But what we are talking about here, right? I mean, one of the things that I really want Democrats, I want progressives to think about is to take in consideration human nature, that there is a human nature. That's a complicated discussion. And what that means, I think, is very complicated. And of course, culture is a huge part of that. Systems are a huge part of that. But like I said, I think that's part of the discussion that has been that's not been part of the discussion on the left. Whereas on the right, to their credit, they don't do it on purpose. Right? Just a naked pursuit of power, right? You learn how to use power. And naked pursuit of naked pursuit of power, you learn how to you learn how to manipulate people, frankly, right? You learn how people behave, and you win. I think, like, I'm not saying that we should become righties and suddenly become authoritarian and lust after power for its own sake. But I do think it's so important that we do that. These third rails that we're not supposed to deal with on the left, right? Power and the idea that there is a human nature, right? That the animal that is Homo sapien does things under certain circumstances, like clockwork. Frankly, if you put a human being under certain circumstances, you can expect certain behavior. For example, you can expect people who are impoverished and oppressed to behave just like people who are impoverished and oppressed behave everywhere in the world, right? Like, it's a very similar thing, right?
Yeah, there's certainly similarities. I mean, even like somebody who is privileged, take away their food for 3 days and watch what happens, right?
Exactly. That's exactly right. So my point is that, like, not that we should use these as answers, but like they should be, like, these ideas should be part of the discussion. I don't think they are part of the discussion.
They should.
Enough.
They should. And I think that's a good counterpoint to what I'm saying. I just want to, just to make things clear. Take an issue like, IQ disparities between different ethnic groups, right?
Yes.
If you're going to approach this genetically, essentially, you're going to come to the conclusion that there are racial differences and stuff like that, when there are so many other things to look at before you jump to that, right? We don't want to jump immediately to the biological resolution here. We want to look at why there are, different inequities in society, how they relate to each other, right? The history, the cycles of poverty, all that stuff, and how they relate to this question. Not just say simply, oh, well, it's different human nature, it's biology. That's what the right does, right?
Definitely. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. That is their modus operandi. And what they've done is, in the modern era, dressed it up. It's like the rebrand of neo-Nazis, right? Neo-Nazis don't look like bald-headed skinheads with Nazi tattoos on their arms anymore. I mean, some of them probably do, but that's not what most of them do. I mean, the people at Charlottesville look like someone that I could work with at my company, right? Yeah. Like, I mean, they just look like average white guys. And so my point is, they've done this rebrand, the alt-right rebrand, so it doesn't come off as so scary. And what they've done similarly with biology and with the essentialism, right? That certain people, and one of my favorites is this, Joe, which is like, no, it's not that I'm racist against black people. I just don't like black culture. Yeah. And that's a workaround, right? So basically what you're doing is you're rebranding your biological based racism as a cultural thing, that, you know what I mean? And this is the sort of thing that we need to make sure we don't go down that road, and that we're continuing to fight against that.
Absolutely. Yeah. It is something we should keep very much a focus on, like keep our crosshairs on this, because the right does want to control the narrative very much. And we don't want to give them, we don't want to fuel what they're doing with these identity essentialist arguments they're making about transgender, about women, about, Black Americans, all that stuff. We don't want to fuel that.
No, we don't. We really don't. And it's hard. I mean, I think kind of the things the last few weeks we've been talking about, the last few episodes, we've been talking about some of these really hard, thorny issues. Like, how do Democrats combat that right-wing narrative, right? Like, and these sort of, and, you know, listeners and viewers out there, sorry, we don't have clear-cut answers. Believe me, we are trying our best to think about this stuff and write about this stuff. We have some articles that we're putting together about some of these issues, but these are hard. These are really hard issues. There's not easy answers. And like I say, I think the right, because they're willing to do and say anything, right? They don't have the same, and also because of the religious element of it too, means that like you can kind of make up your reality as you go along. You can make up your ethics as you go along, and we are fighting with one hand behind our back in some sense.
Yeah, and by the way, let's not forget, we're not dealing with just conservatives anymore. We're not. Steve Bannon is not a conservative.
That's right.
He's a fascist. Mm-hmm. Okay, and we're dealing with fascism. We're dealing with like. That's right. Them wanting to use the state apparatus to control society. That's not right. Conservatism.
No.
Right. You know, and we can talk a million years about the problems of conservatism, but we're dealing with something a little bit different as well as conservatism now.
Super
and so
important.
The right wing, alt-right, will take this argument to the highest level. I mean, that's the history, right? That it is the same history playing itself out. Yeah. Right. It's superiority arguments. It's argument, and they make sometimes couch it in culture, like the Western civilization is just a superior civilization.
Exactly. See, that's what I'm saying. That's that rebrand I'm talking about, man. That's that rebrand I'm talking about.
But we can't be fooled by it.
No.
It's the same stuff.
It's the same old stuff. Yeah. It's the same old stuff that they've been saying and doing for a long time. And what scares me, and this is actually a great sort of transition into what we're going to be talking about next, and we're going to finish up the show with this, is they are recruiting young men like very, very quickly, very, very easily. And one of the things that we talk about, and I want to just talk because, and in a lot of the ways they hang their hat on is, and this is really true of fascism, of old school fascism and sort of this neo-fascism, is manhood and masculinity, right? And this sort of idea of this pure man, right? And that is one of the things I want to talk about next, because one of the ideas about which my father and I rarely agreed was masculinity, what it means to be, quote, a man. Mm-hmm. And I bring this up both because I think that people are going to run into their conservative uncle spewing this nonsense sometimes at Christmas, but also because I think masculinity and its corollary, its patriarchy, are among some of the premier social and political issues of our day. Sure. And what I want to do is just sort of illustrate this just briefly. So a guy that I know that I used to play hockey with, young guy, he was like 18 when I met him, right? And I was, whatever, in my 30s. And nice kid, but I've watched him become, so now this is years later, and now he's probably in his mid-20s or so. And I've seen him start to get like pulled in that direction, where now he's posting Tucker Carlson stuff, right? Yeah. And all these sort of like this sort of right-wing media stuff. And one of the things, as I think about how this happens to kids, right? How this happens to young people, I think that I think the masculinity element plays really well and really very much into this. I mean, conservatives have always had this idea of like, we are the tough ones, right? Yeah. We are pro-gun, pro-war, right? We're not going to let those sissy liberals ruin our country. And, I think that if we don't, and this goes back to my whole thing, if we don't come up, or if we don't emphasize or discuss or be willing to talk about a new or a thoughtful definition of masculinity, right? One that isn't toxic, right? Because again, we've ceded this area to conservatives. We've ceded the power discussion to conservatives. We've ceded the biology element to conservatives. And we've ceded the discussion about masculinity to conservatives. And so they look at us as a bunch of foofy, froofy, whatever, right? And for young men, that is not attractive. for many, many young men, the toughness is very attractive, right? They're like, oh, come on. Anyway, so how do you think about that, Joe?
Well, all these things, I mean, there's a lot there. I mean,
there's
all
a
these
lot
things,
there, yeah.
All these
Say
things
whatever you want.
Yeah. All these, by the way, somebody called me a soy boy a while back, and I thought it was just so funny. I couldn't stop laughing.
It's just so stupid and childish. And by the way, Trump was the embodiment of this like absurd masculinity, right? Like,
but you know what? Sorry. Go ahead. Finish.
No, go for it.
I think I could have kicked his ass. I really didn't. I'm just kidding. Anyway. We've seeded a lot of stuff because it's easy for the right to make these arguments because they come out of our history. They come out of our culture, right? They are embedded in stories, in literature, in movies, and everything, right? And so they can, men shouldn't act like that. Look, see, this is what history tells. This is what the Bible tells us. This is what, look at John Wayne, man. Exactly. It's all this stuff. So it's easy for them to take power, to take charge of the narratives here. On the left, on the other hand, we're about progress. That means change, right? About evolution, social evolution, and all that stuff. And so we have visions about how we can be better, right? The left doesn't. They have visions about how they can be like, take advantage of their power.
That's it.
Right? And so, but in terms of this toxicity, male toxicity thing, I have problems with that narrative. And I think we need to be better about it. I think, again, the quickness of it, right? The how quickly, all the things you mentioned about how the right recruits young men and all that, and how they do change so quickly. The quickness of it doesn't suggest an evolutionary biological genesis there, right? It just, maybe there is a propensity that comes from our biology, maybe. But let's think about this, right? We're not talking about looking at bulls and chimps and see how males of their species are so aggressive. Yes, of course they are. And, and does that mean that humans are the same way? It's kind of like in early evolutionary science, right? There was Darwinism and in the early 20th century, all that. It was established theory that competition was like the fittest, adaptation, the human strategy used. That's how, we're able to sort of be successful, right? Human competition. There's competition in nature, hence, therefore, there must be competition in humanity. And, the image comes to mind of these great Neolithic hunters with a big game, hunting bison and mastodons and stuff like that. That's Stone Age masculinity, right, that we can look up to. No, it's not true. None of that's true, right? In the 1970s, the theory was challenged, this thing, by a growing body of evidence that human social relations and human collaboration, right, are more important. Yes. And they are the adaptive strategy to make us survive and thrive. Right. And in other words, culture, right? And by the way, big game hunters represent a small fraction of the kinds of practices you saw in Neolithic times, right? People did not engage in those things very often. It's rare. They are not representative. But it's like there is certainly an element of biology, like we talked about, that is important to look at, that shapes behavior, no doubt about that. But then again, to my larger point, society mediates any such tendencies through all kinds of cultural practices and institutional forms. So your earlier question was, why have things devolved, right? Why have we seen this rise in like toxic masculinity and all that? Those institutions that I just talked about and cultural forms, right, can alter over time. They can change in ways that bring back the savage, right? In this case of toxic masculinity, the myriad of implicit and official cultural checks and balances that mediate the tendency of how men behave are undermined. And that bad behavior escalates because of these changes in our culture. Like, for example, the use of YouTube and going after video game users, like the right challenging social justice, all of this stuff, like changes in policy. I think we have to be very careful about this savage in us. Yes, we are animals and we do have savage in us, but we have to be mindful of the narrative, how the narrative is portrayed, right? It's cogent and based on evidence that we are biological beings. We're just animals that just happen to have thumbs and bigger brains and all that. We do have lizard brain, right? And that acts out. We talked about that. But it's the narrative, right, that we have to be careful where that leads us. And we don't want to go back to pre-World War II ways of thinking, right? And we don't want to go back to that because that's essentially a very essentialist point of view that's very dangerous. And we know this by history, right? So take a look at, for example, machismo, right, in Latin America and Mediterranean countries. There's certainly some of that in Italy as well, right? In Spain and other places like that. It has many elements of what we call now toxic masculinity in it, don't you think? Yeah?
Oh, definitely.
So,
oh, my God, yes.
In machismo, what's machismo? It's a cultural way of looking at the world. And those elements are deemed natural. In many cases, they're celebrated. And that greatly shapes the way men act. And to think about it just in terms of like brain chemistry or hormones is just essentially inaccurate because there's more to it than that, right? A child raising in the machismo culture is much more likely to act that way than someone who is not. And perhaps someday we'll have a pill that changes our chemistry and makes us, worthy members of the Federation of Planets, right? It will just be so cool. But in the meantime, we can look at our practices and our institutions for answers here. Society shaped by universal nurturing, collaborative practices rather than aggressive and competitive ones will have more nurturing and collaborative men, people in general, right?
Definitely.
There are a million ways to do that. Right? On a large scale, we need better systems. We talk about this all the time in the radical secular system-based thinking. That's what's playing out, by the way, in the Me Too movement, right? They're demanding better systems of support and accountability to fight against sexual misconduct. That's what's playing out with the Black Lives Matter movement, right? Better systems to have a more justice in that regards. What is the response from the right? It's an essentially, basically these new rules go against our nature, right? Men aren't supposed to do that. Right, all that. This is how men and women are. See, this is how they are. So, give me that damn beer and let's move on. It's nature. It's biology. What are you fighting about, you idiot libtards? Right? I mean, that's basically what they're saying.
Definitely.
And what we're saying is no. There's lots more to it than that. Right?
Yeah.
Wake
definitely.
up. Right? That's what we're saying, literally. And then they make fun of that. Oh, you wokeness, right?
Oh, God. It's just layers and layers and layers of this stuff, right? I mean, and, so really we are, what I wanted to, first of all, let me start by saying this is like, natural does not equal good. Right. A lot of the things that happen in nature are not things that we want to happen. Right. I mean, that's precisely why we have a society, is because we realize that nature kind of sucks sometimes. Right. Like it's hard to live. It's dangerous. And sometimes people are assholes to each other, and people are definitely assholes to each other when they don't have enough resources to go around. Like that is what happens. Right. So and that's why cultural norms, like you said, cultural norms, laws, all these things are incredibly, incredibly important. So I don't want to make it seem like I'm trying to reduce the human experience, human nature.
I don't think you're doing that. No.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Because I definitely don't think that.
No, I know that.
Yeah. I mean,
I'm just presenting I'm just kind of arguing, like in a debate. Like I'm just trying to make a point.
Absolutely, and I appreciate it. Totally. And like, so I when we're not talking about the biological element as one among many elements, and an important one, right? It might be true that men are, and I'm not even taking a position on this. I'm saying it might be true that men are more aggressive than women naturally, right? That might be true. But even if that is true, it doesn't follow that, right, that a culture of machismo is natural. That is not
right.
Right.
Exactly.
No. Right.
Well said.
And in fact, right, because even if we decide that yes, men are more aggressive or whatever, then it's like, well, that all the more reason to make sure our norms don't exacerbate that problem, right? Our norms should do the opposite, right? Our culture should do the opposite. It shouldn't celebrate this stuff. It shouldn't celebrate wanting to dominate everyone you see or sleep around. That's one of my favorites, right? It's like, oh, well, I'm a man. What can I say? You know, I like women.
I can't help it, man.
I can't help it, right? And that's just a load of bullshit. And what it is, you want to talk about patriarchy, man. I mean, you want to talk about that is patriarchy, right? This idea that that men are destined to sort of lead women, and that is natural. That is the natural place. And right, religion. We talk about secularism on this on around here a lot because, right, if we followed the religious way of doing things, then those hierarchies would be very, very rigid indeed, with men absolutely at the top of them, right? And so these are bad ideas. And so we need to be prepared to challenge those ideas, especially when they come from the right. But I also think that, again, because these things are dangerous, a lot of people, for example, don't want to talk about free will, because if you talk about free will, and I don't really think there is really free will, that's me personally, but it doesn't be... But people get very afraid of that because then it's like, well, then how do you assign accountability, right? Like, how are people responsible for things then? Or criminals should just all go free? And again, I don't think that because it's a third rail, that it's scary, that it has implications that are kind of scary, that we shouldn't talk about it. I think we have to embrace these ideas and really get to the bottom of them, and then we can reasonably say, yeah, well, that was the idea that machismo must come from elements of male biology is fucking bullshit, right? It's fucking bullshit. Anyway, do you have anything else you want to say?
Well, as a corollary to that, I think that on the small scale, we need to work on ourselves and be introspective for those reasons. Exactly, right? We're all conditioned to a great degree. Yes. If there is free will, it's certainly squashed most of the time, right? right. Introspection is a way of making that largely unconscious conditioning conscious. So we're aware of it. And then when we're aware of it, we can do something about it, right? This is the reason why, for example, anti-racism is so important. Mm-hmm. We want to make it conscious because we're being racist in an implicit, unconscious way oftentimes. And you have to become aware before you can change it. Same applies to toxic masculinity, right? It's this very same thing, right? So one of the problems, I think, is that we tend to think very dualistically, nurture or nature, and I think we can challenge that. I think we can talk about that at some point. I might want to say a few things at the end about that. But anyway, did you have any thoughts yourself?
No, I mean, not really. I mean, I'm just trying to when I think about masculinity, I mean, I interact with people on the internet. I interact with people in my life, I mean, just the fragility of men, like the men who say how tough they are, right? Here's a great example. On the Radical Secular Instagram feed, everybody should go sign up for that, by the way. I posted something. Oh, you know what? I posted the little video clip, 1 minute video clip about the microaggressions, right? And it was a very popular clip in general, but popular clips also attract everybody, right? They're popular for a lot of reasons, right? And so one guy just simply says, all he says is, grow the fuck up. That's what he said, right? And so this is a dude responding to me. By the way, I'm not pointing fingers in that clip. All I'm literally saying is what happened to me, right? And I want to say to this guy, how are you? By the way, he would call me, a snowflake and all these kind of things. Like, you're the guy who can't handle just literally the facts, right? Like, you can't even and he didn't respond at all because it was like but this is what I find so often with these guys who walk around beating their chests, driving the most polluting pickup truck they could possibly buy, right? Like, not talking about their feelings and what we and I think that this narrative that we on the left who are prepared to do those sort of things, who are prepared to be introspective, who are prepared to work with others, not trying to dominate others, who are prepared to elevate women, because we realize that one of the hugest problems with human society is that women do not have an equal say. And if we had a little more balance, things would be a lot better. We'd be better off. I guarantee you we'd be better off as a society. Yeah. Definitely we would. And so we on the left are prepared to do that. And I want to, as a person, I want to be a guy who's standing up and challenging. You talk about challenging the narrative that there's something non-masculine about being that way, that being masculine means just being like a bull in a china closet, like these kind of ideas. And I think that, again, that's another one of these ideas that we on the left have to continue to challenge, because we are losing young people to this. We are losing young men to this. We really, really are.
Yeah, and I think we need to start, maybe, there's so many levels to this, but one of them is thinking about this in a better way.
Yeah.
If we want to make sense of it, we need to make sense of it. We need to make sense of power. We need to make sense of this question as well, and I think this whole nature or nurture thing that we've been talking about in the show around evolutionary biology and culture we can sort of challenge the paradigm of the whole question, right? We need to think about this as being caught in a dualistic paradigm that's really old hat now.
Definitely.
Right? We know better. We're learning. So I'm going to get a little bit out there here. Okay, I'm going to introduce some thoughts and see how it goes. Maybe it won't make any sense. I don't know. But human behavior is not shaped by nature. Human behavior is not shaped by nurture. It's not even that middle of the road, it's just a mix of both compromise. It's not that either. No, there is no real separation between nature and nurture. They are inextricably linked and part of the same thing, the same phenomena. In other words, it's not dualistic. Culture arises out of a collection of human minds, just like the human mind arises out of brain architecture, then culture arises out of the collection of all those minds working together. They are both emergent properties whose sum is greater than their parts. All of this, and I don't mean that in a religious way whatsoever. I mean that in a very practical way, like measurable way. All of this is synergistic. The mind reflects back upon brain structures. Stress, for example, literally changes the physical structure of the brain over time. We've documented that, right? Culture reflects back on individual minds, reshaping thoughts, as we talked about in the show. What this means is that culture is not only a consequence of evolution, it is in itself an evolutionary agent, right? It has been since the beginning. And of course, now with 21st century technology, it's more so than ever. So the question of something like what is male toxicity? What's the cause of it? Is it biological? Is it cultural? All that stuff can be approached in this light as well. The very idea of maleness can be as well, right? So that we can think about, okay, it is a process that's happening, right? So in this process involves this merger, this synchronicity between nature and nurture. That's how we should be looking at it. I don't know if that makes any sense whatsoever.
I think it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I mean, because the rejection of dualism, I think, is super important. I really think I think that is like the idea that we tend to think of things this way, and this sort of on-off switch, this, that. I mean, right? One of the most obvious example, or an obvious example of this, is gender, right? We think of things as man, woman, and everything, by the way. Literally, languages are built that way.
Yes.
Right? But that is, in fact, not realistic. And not only is it not realistic, but it's detrimental, like actively detrimental, right? So much so that you get these spin-off crazy people, like craziness, like that's represented by Trump style masculinity, right? This hyper masculinity, and it's not useful. It is in some ways tearing our country apart. And so I think so anyway, the point is, I like the way you're thinking about this. I think I like that you're thinking about it holistically.
Yeah, that's true, Christophe. And also, it isn't just detrimental, because it is certainly detrimental, because people can then draw the wrong conclusion that fits their narrative, right?
Exactly.
From it. But it's also a barrier to understanding the world better, right? It puts a limit, it puts a check on our consciousness and our ability to comprehend the world. And so we have to be better than that. And I think we are, as it's starting to be. Certainly in science, we're seeing a huge sort of evolution in thinking about many subjects. There's a renaissance of thinking about how to approach the world and so forth. And I think we need to challenge ourselves to do the same. So a lot of the issues that we're struggling with, right, we can probably make sense of them a lot more by seeing the larger connections, seeing the interrelationships, the synchronicities, the recursiveness of so much of this stuff. Yeah. And I think that ultimately will lead to better solutions.
Well said. And I think a great way to end the show. I think one of the things that we've talked about a lot is obviously this nature-nurture undue bifurcation there, right? That's perhaps not even realistic. But another thing we've talked about, a theme that we kept coming back to, is not ceding the ground, being willing to have hard conversations around power, right? Around maybe biology, around masculinity, about these ideas where the right has really taken root and grown. One of the things that Democrats always say and never do is that, like, we don't want to cede any territory in the United States, right? Like, but so often what we've done is we've just run out of the country, of the state, and said, like, it's not worth fighting in Alabama anymore, right? Yeah, and maybe it really isn't. But the analogy I'm trying to make is that we cannot, certainly on these big issues, power chief among them. This is something that we need to learn and understand on the left and be conversant in, while simultaneously, like you say in your article, and how you've said multiple times over the show, is keeping the introspection element alive and well. So we're constantly sort of monitoring ourselves, right? And making sure that we are doing this in a way that is ethical.
Yes, that's it. That's it.
And that's important. Yeah. Well, thanks, Joe. It's been awesome. And everyone else out there, remember that if you like our show, and you definitely should like it, make sure to subscribe, leave a review, check our Patreon, and tell your friends to listen. New episodes post Mondays at noon Eastern on YouTube and all the major podcast channels. And we also publish new articles weekly in our journal at theradicalsecular.com. I'm Christophe Defoe. Thank you for being here. And remember, wherever you are, you can be radically secular.
Radical Secular Podcast is written and produced by Christophe Defoe, Sean Prophet, and Joe Occhipinti. Logo and main title designed by Tim Stetner. Post-production and original theme music by Sean Prophet. Special thanks to our support team, Lindsay Brightman, Jillian Sky Jacobs, and Lori Field Occhipinti.